Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way.
Stories from the Appalachian Dark. Story 1. The Cabin on the Ridge. I want to be upfront about something most people don't know about me. I don't scare easy. I grew up in these mountains, McDowell County, West Virginia, the deep end of it, where the hollers narrow out and the ridge lines close in above you like the walls of a church. I've been in the woods at night more times than I can count. I've heard bobcats scream at 3 in the morning, sounding so much like a woman being murdered that it'll stop your heart mid-beat. I've come across black bears on trails where there wasn't enough room for both of us. I once found a man's boot on the side of a logging road. No foot in it, no explanation, and I just kept driving. That's the kind of place I come from. That's the kind of thing you learn to fold up and put away. But what happened to me at my grandfather's cabin in February of 2019, that's something I've never been able to fold up. It doesn't fit in a drawer. It doesn't shrink with time. If anything, it gets heavier the further I move from it, like the memory itself has weight, and it's leaning on me from behind, waiting for me to turn around and look at it again. My grandfather passed in the fall of 2018, lung cancer. He was 81 and had smoked since he was 12, so nobody was surprised, least of all him. He left the cabin to me in his will, a small 2-room place about 9 miles off the county road, up a gravel track that turned to mud every spring and ice every winter. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a hand pump out back, and a propane lantern he'd used since the 70s. The place was old but solid, built by his father sometime in the late 1940s, back when people still lived that far up because they didn't have a reason not to. I hadn't been up there since I was a teenager, but after the funeral I started thinking about the cabin more and more. I was going through a rough stretch, divorced, working too much, sleeping too little. I thought a weekend alone up there might help me reset. Just me and the quiet. No phone signal, no neighbors, nothing but the trees and the wood stove and whatever I brought with me. I drove up on a Friday afternoon in mid-February. Valentine's Day fell on a Thursday that year, and I remember thinking it was fitting, spending the most romantic day of the year alone in a dead man's cabin on the side of a mountain. The road was worse than I remembered. The last mile was mostly frozen ruts and dead leaves, and by the time I got the truck parked and the cabin door open, the sun was already dropping behind the ridge. The place smelled the way old cabins do: damp wood, cold ash, something faintly sweet beneath it all, like the ghost of every meal ever cooked on that stove. I got the fire going, swept out the worst of the dust, and set up my sleeping bag on the cot in the back room. I'd brought canned soup, coffee, a bottle of bourbon, and 2 paperbacks. That was my entire plan. The first night was exactly what I needed. I sat by the stove, reading until my eyes got heavy, then crawled into the sleeping bag and listened to the fire tick and pop as it burned down. The silence up there is different from silence anywhere else. It's not empty, it's full of the small sounds that fill in when the big ones go away. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind pressing against the walls, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the leaves outside. I fell asleep before 10 o'clock and didn't wake until morning. Saturday was cold and clear. I spent the day walking the property, checking the tree line, sitting on the porch with my coffee, watching the fog burn off the valley below. I found some old tools in the shed and tightened a couple of loose boards on the porch railing. It felt good to work with my hands again. By the time the sun went down, I was tired in a clean, honest way I hadn't felt in months. I made my dinner, read another few chapters, and settled in for the night. The fire was low but steady. The wind had picked up and I could hear it moving through the bare trees outside, that dry scratching sound that branches make when there's nothing left on them. I turned down the lantern and closed my eyes. I don't know exactly what time it was when the knocking started. My watch said a few minutes past 2 when I finally looked at it, but the knocking had already been going for what felt like a while before I was fully awake. It came in sets of 3, slow, deliberate, evenly spaced, not frantic, not urgent, patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world and knew I was inside. I sat up on the cot and stared at the front door. The fire had burned to embers, and the only light came from the faint orange glow leaking from the stove's vent. The cabin was nearly pitch dark. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, same pace, same weight, each one landing like a closed fist on old wood, firm enough to rattle the latch. I didn't answer. I didn't call out. Something in me, something I think I inherited from every person who ever lived in these mountains, told me not to make a sound. I just sat there in the dark, watching the door, barely breathing. The knocking stopped for maybe 30 seconds. There was nothing, just silence and the faint hiss of the dying fire. Then I heard it at the window beside my cot, no more than 2 feet from where I was sitting. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same deliberate patience, but this time on glass, which made the sound sharper, more intimate, like someone tapping on the inside of a fishbowl trying to get the attention of whatever's swimming around in there. I turned and looked. The window was a small single pane, old and cloudy, and all I could see through it was the snow and the dark shapes of the trees beyond. No figure, no face, just the empty winter night looking back at me. The knocking didn't come again. I sat there until dawn. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from the cot except once to put another log on the fire because the cold was becoming unbearable. Every small sound, every creak, every gust of wind sent a jolt through me, but nothing else happened. No more knocking, no voices, nothing. When the first gray light came through the windows, I pulled on my boots and coat and went outside. The air was bitter, maybe 15 degrees, and the snow from the previous week had crusted over with a thin layer of ice that crunched under my feet. I walked around to the side of the cabin where the window was, expecting to find nothing, expecting to tell myself I'd dreamed it. I found footprints, bare footprints, human. No shoes, no boots, just the clear impression of 2 bare feet pressed into the frozen snow, toes splayed, heels deep. They circled the cabin. Not once or twice. I counted as I followed them, my breath coming out in white clouds and my hands shaking, and not from the cold. They circled the cabin 11 times. 11 complete loops. Each loop overlapped in places where the path repeated, creating a trampled ring around the entire structure, like some kind of ritual I couldn't begin to understand. I followed the trail where it finally broke away from the cabin and headed toward the tree line. The prints moved in a straight line across the clearing, spaced evenly, unhurried. I walked alongside them for maybe 40 yards, keeping my distance the way you might walk beside the tracks of an animal you don't want to catch up to. That's when I stopped. I stood there in the snow, staring at the prints, and the realization came over me slowly, the way cold water rises around your ankles before you understand you're standing in a flood. The direction was wrong. I'd been assuming, the way anyone would, that the prints led away from the cabin and into the woods, that whoever was out there had come, circled, and left. But the prints weren't leading away. The toes were pointed towards the cabin. Every single track, every loop, every circle, whatever made them had come from the woods, walked to the cabin, and then circled it, not the other way around. The trail I was following didn't end at the tree line. It started there. And the loops weren't aimless. Each circuit was slightly tighter than the last. The first loop was maybe 20 feet from the walls, the second 18, the third 15. By the 11th, the prints were right against the foundation, close enough to touch the siding, like something tightening a noose. I followed the final set of prints, the tightest loop, around the back of the cabin, my pulse hammering so hard that I could feel it in my teeth. The trail ended at the crawlspace vent, a small rectangular opening near the base of the foundation, covered by a metal grate that was supposed to be screwed into the wood. The grate was lying on the ground. It hadn't fallen off. The screws were still in it, pulled clean from the wood from the outside. I looked at the dark opening, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. A fear so total and so absolute that it shut down every rational thought in my head. I didn't crouch down to look inside. I didn't call out. I didn't do any of the things a reasonable person might do. I turned around, walked straight to my truck, and started throwing things in the bed. I didn't pack. I didn't fold anything. I didn't even go back inside for my books. I just tossed what I could reach through the front door and left. The drive down the mountain took 20 minutes but felt like an hour. I kept checking the rearview mirror. I kept the windows up and the heat on full. And by the time I hit the paved road, I was shaking so badly I had to pull over and sit with my hands on the steering wheel until my breathing slowed. I didn't go back. Not that weekend, not the next. I called a real estate agent in March and listed the property for well below what it was worth. I didn't care. I wanted it gone. The agent asked if there was anything she should know about the cabin, any issues, any history. I told her no. I told her it just wasn't for me anymore. It sold in April to a couple from Roanoke, a young pair looking for a weekend project, something rustic they could fix up together. I signed the papers, took the money, and told myself I was done thinking about it. Then, the phone call came. It was a Sunday evening in late March of the following year, almost exactly 13 months after that night. The woman, the new owner, called me from a number I didn't recognize. She was polite, but clearly unsettled. She said they'd been doing some work on the cabin, reinforcing the floor, and when they pulled up a section of the old boards, they noticed something. The underside of the floor joists, the thick beams that held the whole cabin up, were covered in scratches. Deep ones, dozens and dozens of them scored into the wood in long, ragged lines, like something had been clawing at the underside of the floor from below. Some of the scratches, she said, were in clusters, groups of 5, spaced like fingers. She asked me if I knew anything about it, if there had been an animal problem, if maybe a raccoon or a possum had gotten into the crawl space at some point. I told her I didn't know. I told her it was probably nothing, and then I hung up and sat in my kitchen and stared at the wall until the room got dark around me. I've thought about it every day since. Not the knocking. That I can almost explain away, almost file under wind or branches or some drunk wandering through the mountains in the cold. It's the footprints that won't leave me. The tightening circles, the crawl space vent pulled open from the outside, the scratches under the floor. Because the thing I can't stop calculating, the thing that wakes me up at 3 in the morning and keeps me staring at the ceiling, is the timeline. Whatever was out there circled that cabin 11 times, barefoot in the snow. Then it pulled the grate off the crawl space and went under the cabin. And then the knocking started, which means it wasn't knocking on the door from the porch. It wasn't tapping on the window from outside. It was already beneath me. It was knocking from below. And when I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, telling myself not to make a sound, it was right there, inches beneath the floorboards, close enough to hear my heartbeat, close enough to reach up through the cracks if the wood had been just a little thinner, a little older, a little weaker. I think about those scratches on the joists. I think about those clusters of 5. I think about what kind of hands leave marks like that in solid wood. And I think about the 11 circles, each one tighter, each one closer, like whatever it was had to work up to it, like it was building its nerve. I don't go to the mountains in February anymore. I don't go to cabins. I don't sleep on the ground floor of any building if I can help it. And some nights, when the house is quiet and the wind picks up outside, I swear I can hear it. 3 slow knocks, coming from somewhere below.
Story 2. The Woman on Route 9. I was driving home from a late shift at the mill. This was February, 3rd week maybe, around 11 at night, when I saw her standing on the shoulder of Route 9. She was maybe 60 yards ahead, caught in my headlights. A thin white nightgown, no coat, no shoes. Just standing there at the edge of the road with the frozen rain coming down in sheets, facing the tree line on the far side of the ditch. I slowed down. People don't stand on the side of Route 9 in February at 11 o'clock at night. Not like that. I pulled over about 10 yards behind her and got out. The rain hit me immediately, that fine, stinging kind that's not quite ice but isn't far off. I walked toward her, boots crunching on the gravel, my breath hanging in front of me in pale clouds that the fog absorbed immediately. I stopped about 5 feet behind her and said, "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need me to call someone?" That's when I noticed her feet. They were bare, as I'd seen from the truck, but up close they looked wrong. The skin was dark, not dirty, not shadowed, dark in the way that skin gets when the blood beneath it has stopped moving. A deep blue-black, mottled and waxy, planted flat in a shallow puddle of ice water that had pooled in a depression on the shoulder. She'd been standing there long enough for the rain to collect around her feet, long enough for the water to partially freeze at the edges of the puddle, forming a thin crust of ice that her ankles broke through. I don't know how long a person would have to stand barefoot in freezing rain for their feet to look like that. Hours at least, maybe longer. "Ma'am," I said, more firmly this time. I reached out and touched her shoulder. She was cold. Not cold like a person who's been outside too long. Cold like the ground. Cold like the rain itself. Like there was no warmth left in her to lose. She turned slowly, not startled, not reactive, just a smooth mechanical rotation of her upper body, as if my touch had activated something. Her face was pale and drawn tight against the bone, her lips slightly parted, tinted a shade of gray I'd never seen on a living person. Her eyes were open, wide open, but they weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, fixed on some middle distance behind my head, focused on something I couldn't see and wouldn't want to. She spoke one sentence, clear and calm, with no tremor, no urgency, no emotion of any kind. Her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "He told me to wait here." That was it. 5 words. She said them, and then she went quiet, and her eyes drifted back toward the tree line, and she turned away from me as slowly as she'd turned toward me, and she was facing the woods again as if I'd never been there at all. I stood there in the rain, my hands still half raised from where I'd touched her shoulder, and I felt something I can only describe as a deep cellular wrongness, like every part of my body was telling me to leave, not to help, not to call out again, not to try to bring her to the truck, just to leave, to get back in the cab and drive and not look in the mirror. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't leave a barefoot woman standing in freezing rain on a dark road in the middle of nowhere. Whatever was wrong with her, hypothermia, a mental break, drugs, I didn't know. She was going to die if someone didn't get her out of the cold. I didn't have cell signal. I hadn't had signal since I turned on to Route 9. The nearest place with a phone was the gas station at the Brenton Junction, about 4 miles east. I told her I was going to get help. She didn't respond. I said it again, louder, nothing. She just stood there, facing the trees, the rain running off her like she was made of stone. I drove to the gas station faster than I should have on those roads. The clerk was half asleep behind the counter and looked at me like I was out of my mind when I told him I needed to use the phone. I called 911 and told the dispatcher what I'd seen, the woman, the
the nightgown, the bare feet, the stretch of Route 9 about 2 miles west of the Brenton Junction. About 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled into the lot. He was an older man, mid-50s maybe, with a weathered face and a calm that felt practiced, like he'd been to enough strange calls that nothing surprised him anymore. He asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told him everything. The nightgown, the feet, the way she stood facing the trees, the words she said. He wrote it all down in a small notebook without much reaction. Then he drove out to the spot. I followed in my truck. She was gone. We parked on the shoulder and walked the area with flashlights. There was no one there. No footprints leading away through the gravel or the mud beyond the shoulder, no blood, no fabric, no trace that anyone had been standing there at all. Except for one thing. In the shallow depression where her feet had been, planted in the frozen mud, there were 2 impressions, clear and deep, the size and shape of bare human feet. The puddle had iced over completely around them, locking the prints in place like a mold. The deputy crouched down and looked at them for a long time. Then he stood up, clicked off his flashlight, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're not the first person to call this in," he said. I asked him what he meant. He told me that over the course of that winter, starting in late November, they'd received 3 other calls about a woman matching the exact same description, on the exact same stretch of road, a thin white nightgown, bare feet, standing on the shoulder, facing the tree line. Each caller described the same thing. She wouldn't respond, she appeared severely hypothermic, and when they went to get help and came back, she was gone. No trace, no footprints, just the impressions of her feet frozen into whatever surface she'd been standing on. I asked him if they had identified her. He shook his head. I asked him if they had any idea who she might be, a patient from a facility, a missing person, anyone. He shook his head again. Then he said something that I have turned over in my mind every night since. He said it quietly, almost like he was talking to himself, like he'd forgotten I was standing there. The first report we have on file is from February of 1987. I stared at him. He didn't elaborate. He just put his notebook in his pocket, told me to drive safe, and walked back to his cruiser. I watched his taillights disappear into the fog. And then I stood there alone on the shoulder of Route 9 in the freezing rain, looking at the 2 bare footprints frozen into the mud, and I felt the cold settle into me in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. That was 32 years before my call. 32 years of someone or something standing on that road in February, barefoot in a nightgown, facing the trees, waiting for whoever told her to wait there. And she did, for 32 years at least. I think about whether she's in pain. I think about whether she knows she's there. I think about whether she's still waiting right now, in the dark, in the fog, in the place where the road bends and the trees lean in close, her face turned toward the woods, her lips moving around words no one will ever hear clearly. And I think about the worst possibility of all, the one that sits in my chest like a stone and won't dissolve no matter how many times I tell myself it's impossible. That whoever told her to wait there is still out in those woods, that he's been there the whole time, that she's not waiting for someone to come. She's waiting for someone to follow her in. I drive a little faster through that stretch now, and I never, ever look at the tree line. Story 3. The Voice on Dalton Run. I've been carrying mail in Randolph County, West Virginia for 11 years. Rural route, which means I'm not walking a sidewalk in town dropping letters through slots. I'm driving a right-hand drive Jeep Cherokee along 40 miles of mountain roads, some paved, most not, delivering to mailboxes nailed to fence posts and leaning trees, and in one case bolted to the rusted frame of a tractor that hasn't moved since the Johnson administration. The route covers 3 haulers, 2 ridge lines, and a stretch of river valley that floods every spring like clockwork. I know every curve, every pothole, every dog that's going to chase the truck, and every dog that's going to let me pass. I know which houses get packages, which houses only get bills, and which houses get nothing at all for weeks at a time because the people inside have either left or stopped caring about the outside world. After 11 years, I can tell the difference between a branch falling and a deer stepping through brush at 200 yards. I can tell when a creek is running normal and when it's rising. I can tell when the silence is natural and when it's the kind of silence that means something nearby has made everything else go quiet. February is the worst month on the route. The days are short and gray, the roads are perpetually glazed with black ice, and the fog comes in off the river valley and sits in the hollers like something that's moved in and isn't planning to leave. Some mornings it's so thick that I can't see the mailbox until I'm right on top of it. The old-timers around here call February the dead month, not because of the cold, because of how still everything gets, like the mountains are holding something in their lungs and waiting to see if it's going to pass. The stretch of road where it happened is called Dalton Run, though I doubt you'd find that name on any official map. It's a 2-mile gravel road that branches off the county route and winds along the edge of a ravine before dead-ending at a hollow where about 12 families live. The ravine drops off sharp on the left side of the road, maybe 80 feet down to the creek at the bottom, steep enough that if you went off the edge, you'd roll before you'd slide. The right side is a wall of hillside thick with rhododendron and hemlock, the kind of growth that stays green even in February and makes the road feel like a tunnel. It was a Tuesday morning, somewhere around 9:30. The fog on Dalton Run was the worst I'd seen it all winter. Solid, dense, a wall of white gray that started about 4 feet off the ground and went straight up as far as I could tell. My headlights just reflected back at me, so I turned them off and relied on the fog lights, which cast a low yellow glow across the gravel about 10 feet ahead of the bumper. Beyond that, the world simply stopped existing. I was about halfway through the run, maybe a quarter mile past the Hadley mailbox, when I heard the voice. It came from below the road, down in the ravine, somewhere in the fog below the drop-off. A child's voice, young, maybe 8 or 9, the kind of voice that hasn't settled yet, still high and clear, and it was calling for help. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." I took my foot off the gas and let the truck roll to a stop. I sat there with the engine idling, both hands on the wheel, listening. The fog pressed against the windows like something alive. The voice came again, fainter this time. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." Same words, same inflection, same cadence, every syllable identical to the first time, like a sentence being read from a card. I put the truck in park and got out. I walked to the left edge of the road where the gravel gave way before the ground dropped away into the ravine. I couldn't see the bottom, just the fog, thick and still, filling the ravine like water fills a bowl. "Hello?" I called out. "Where are you? Can you hear me?" Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Then the voice rising up from the fog below the drop-off. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." My heart was going. A child in that ravine, in this cold, in this fog, they'd be hypothermic in an hour if they weren't already. I took my foot off the road, putting my right foot on the slope. The ground was slick with frost and dead leaves, and I immediately felt my boots start to slide. I grabbed a rhododendron branch to steady myself and leaned forward, peering down into the white. Nothing. "I'm coming," I called. "Keep talking so I can find you. Tell me where you are." Nothing. The fog absorbed my voice the way water absorbs a stone. I was about to call out again when I heard it. The voice behind me, up on the road, near my truck. "Please, I'm down here. Please help me." The exact same voice, the exact same words, the exact same cadence, the exact same pitch. Not an echo, no delay, no distortion, no spatial quality that would suggest the sound had bounced off something and come back. It was the same sentence played from a different location, like someone had picked up a speaker and moved it, like someone had pressed play from 20 feet behind me, up on the gravel, right next to the driver's side door of my Jeep. I turned around slowly. The fog on the road was so thick that I could barely make out the shape of my truck. There was no child on the road.
There was nothing on the road, but the voice was there, right there, close enough that if I'd been standing next to the truck instead of on the slope, I could have reached out and touched whoever was speaking. I don't remember making a decision. My body made it for me, the same way your hand pulls back from a hot surface before your brain registers the heat. I was off the slope and back on the road in 2 steps, in the truck in 3, and had it in drive before I had even pulled the door all the way shut. I drove the rest of Dalton Run without stopping, delivering the remaining mailboxes by barely slowing down and shoving the mail in with one hand while the other kept the wheel steady. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped 2 packages in the mud and didn't go back for them. The last house on the run was a woman named Edith Combs. She was in her 70s, lived alone, and had one of those mailboxes at the end of a long dirt driveway. But that morning, I needed a phone. Cell signal was non-existent on Dalton Run, and I needed to call the sheriff's office because despite what I'd heard, despite the wrongness of it, there was still a possibility that a real child was down in that ravine. Edith was on her porch when I pulled up. She was wrapped in a heavy coat with a wool scarf pulled up to her chin, sitting in a metal rocking chair with a mug of something steaming in her hands, and she was watching me in a way that made me feel like she'd been expecting me. I told her what I'd heard. I asked to use her phone. She listened without interrupting. When she finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she set her mug down on the porch railing and said very calmly, "You didn't go down the slope, did you?"
I told her I'd taken 1 step down, but came back when I heard the voice behind me. She nodded slowly, and something in her face loosened. Not quite relief, but close to it. The way you look when someone tells you they almost stepped on a snake, but saw it in time. She let me use her phone. I called the sheriff's office. They said they'd send someone. When I came back out to the porch, Edith was standing at the railing, looking down the road toward the stretch where I'd stopped, even though it was invisible in the fog. "They won't find anything," she said. She said it with certainty, the way you'd say the sun won't rise in the west. Then she told me. People had been hearing that voice on Dalton Run for as long as she could remember, always in February, always during the fog, always in the same stretch of road above the deepest part of the ravine. Her grandmother had heard it in the early 1960s, walking the road on foot before it was even graveled. A child's voice calling from below, asking for help. Her grandmother had started down the slope before her husband grabbed her arm and pulled her back. He'd heard it shift, the same voice appearing suddenly from a different direction, too quickly, too cleanly, as if the sound itself had moved rather than its source. Edith said the old people on Dalton Run had a word for it. They called it a lure. Not a ghost, not a spirit, not a demon. They were specific about that distinction. A lure. Something that mimicked a sound designed to draw a person off the road and down into the ravine. Something that used a child's voice because a child's voice is the one thing almost any person will respond to without thinking. The one sound that bypasses every rational calculation and goes straight to the part of your brain that says move, help, now. I asked her what happened to people who followed it down. She looked at me for a long time, the fog moving behind her like a living curtain, and said, "They don't come back up." She said it simply, without drama. Over the decades, people had gone into that ravine and not returned. The searches would find nothing, no body, no clothing, no sign that anyone had been there. The ravine wasn't that deep. The creek at the bottom wasn't that fast. There was nowhere a person could go that dogs couldn't follow. But the dogs would lose the trail at the edge of the road every time. The scent would just end, as if the person had evaporated at the point where the gravel met the slope. She said her grandmother's theory was that the lure wasn't coming from the ravine at all. It was coming from something in the fog itself. Something that used the ravine the way a fisherman uses water, as a place where the thing you're catching is already out of its element, already disoriented, already unable to get back to solid ground once it realizes something is wrong. The fog was the medium, the voice was the bait, and the ravine was just the place where the line went tight. The sheriff's deputy called me back that afternoon. They'd searched the ravine for 2 hours. No child, no tracks, no sign of anyone. He asked if I was sure about what I'd heard. I told him I was. He made a note and closed the report. I still drive Dalton Run every day. I keep the windows up,
I keep the radio louder than I'd normally want it, and when the fog comes in thick and the ravine disappears into white silence on my left, I do not slow down. Edith Combs passed away last November. Heart failure, peaceful in her sleep. In all that time, she only mentioned the voice to me twice, that first morning, and once more the following February, when she stopped me at her mailbox and asked quietly if I'd heard it again. I told her I had. She nodded and said, "Don't ever answer it with your name. Whatever you do, don't let it know your name." I didn't ask why. Some things you don't need explained. Some instructions make more sense the less you understand them. February is here again. The fog is back. And yesterday morning on Dalton Run, about halfway through the stretch above the ravine, I heard the voice. Same words, same child, same desperate plea rising out of the white nothing below the road. But this time, there was a difference. A small one. One that made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. This time, the voice used my name.
Story 4. The Walk from Harold's House. I've lived on Sutter Mill Road for 14 years. It's a dead-end gravel road about 6 miles outside of Floyd, Virginia, at the base of a mountain that doesn't have a name anyone agrees on. The locals call it Bald Ridge because of the treeless summit, but it's not on any map that way. The road runs about a mile from the paved county route to a turnaround at the end where the gravel gives way to a logging track that hasn't been maintained since the 80s. There are 3 properties on the road. Mine is the first, about a quarter mile in. Edmund Pruitt was the second, another quarter mile past mine. The third belongs to a family named Overstreet, who use their place as a seasonal cabin and haven't been up since October. For most of the year, it was just me and Edmund, and that suited us both fine. I moved out here after my wife passed. Cancer, long process, short ending. When it was over, I didn't want to be around people anymore. Not out of bitterness or despair. I just needed a different kind of quiet than what the world was offering. The house on Sutter Mill Road was cheap, solid, and far enough from everything that I could go 3 or 4 days without hearing another human voice. The mountain at my back, the woods on all sides, the road that went nowhere and connected to nothing. Exactly what I needed. Edmund was already there when I arrived. He'd been on that road longer than anyone, 30 years at least, probably more. He lived in a small frame house with a tin roof and a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. The property was neat but not fussy. He kept the grass cut, the firewood stacked, the gutters clear. He had a vegetable garden in the summer that produced more than one man could eat, and he'd leave bags of tomatoes and squash on my mailbox post without a note, just the vegetables in a brown paper sack and the understanding that I'd know who they came from. Edmund was not a talker. In 14 years, I doubt we exchanged more than a few hundred sentences total. He'd wave when we passed on the road. He'd nod if we happened to be checking our mailboxes at the same time. Once or twice a year, he'd stop by with something practical, a tool he thought I might need, a heads up about a tree that looked ready to come down across the road. He never came inside my house, and I never went inside his. We had an understanding built on proximity and respect rather than friendship, and it worked. In a place this remote, that's often the best kind of neighbor you can have, someone who's there but doesn't need you to know it. Edmund died on December 19th. Heart attack. His daughter Nora found him 2 days later when he didn't answer the phone. She had driven up from Roanoke to check on him, found him on the kitchen floor. The paramedics said it was quick, which is the thing people always say whether it's true or not because the alternative is too heavy to hand to a grieving daughter. I went to the funeral. Small service at a church in Floyd, maybe 20 people, most of them Edmund's age or older. Nora spoke briefly. The pastor read from Ecclesiastes. I shook Nora's hand, told her I was sorry, and drove home. That night the road felt different. Not quiet. The quiet was the same, but the quality of it had changed. It was the difference between being alone by choice and being alone because there's no one left. Edmund's house was dark. His porch light, which had run on a timer and clicked on every evening at 5 o'clock for as long as I'd known him, stayed off. The house sat in the dark like a held breath. January passed. I didn't think about Edmund more than normal. Grief has its own schedule, and mine had been calibrated years ago when Ellen died. I knew how to carry the weight of someone's absence without letting it pull me under.
February 3rd was a Monday. I'd been into town for groceries and was driving back up Suttermill Road around 5 in the evening. The sun was already behind the ridge, and the light had that thin gray quality it gets in winter when the day doesn't really end so much as slowly give up. I was passing Edmund's property when I saw him. He was standing at the end of his driveway next to his mailbox, the same spot where I'd seen him 100 times over the years, standing in that patient, unhurried way of his, like a man who had nowhere to be and was comfortable with that fact. He was wearing the flannel shirt, the heavy red and black plaid that he wore from October through March, so faded and softened with washing that it looked like it was part of him rather than something he put on. His hands were at his sides, his posture was straight. He was facing down the road toward my house as if he'd been watching for my truck. I took my foot off the gas. The truck slowed to a crawl and then stopped, maybe 40 yards from where he stood. He didn't wave. Edmund always waved. In 14 years, he had never once failed to raise his hand when he saw me on the road. But he stood there, still. His face turned toward me, too far away to read in the failing light, and he didn't move at all. I stared for maybe 30 seconds. Then he turned. Not quickly, not suddenly, with a slow, stiff rotation of his whole body, as if his joints were reluctant, and walked around the side of his house, not toward the front door, not up the porch steps, around the corner of the building and out of sight, moving with a gait that was close to Edmund's, but not quite right, a little too measured, a little too even. I sat in the truck for a long time after he disappeared. I told myself what any rational person would tell themselves. It was someone else, a relative, people who looked like Edmund because they shared his blood. I drove home. I didn't sleep well. The next evening, I was on my porch around the same time, sitting with a cup of coffee as the light went down. I looked up the road toward Edmund's place, and there he was. Same spot, same shirt, same posture, standing by his mailbox, facing my direction, but closer, not at his mailbox this time, further down his driveway, maybe 20 yards closer to my property than he'd been the night before, as if he'd taken a few steps toward my house and stopped. I stood. I walked to the edge of my porch and looked at him. The distance was maybe 150 yards and the light was almost gone, but I could see him clearly enough to confirm what I already knew. It was Edmund, not someone who looked like Edmund, the man I'd watched for 14 years, the man I'd seen lowered into the ground 6 weeks ago. Standing on his property in a dead man's shirt, looking at my house. He stood there for about a minute, then he turned with that same stiff rotation and walked behind his house again. Gone. I called Nora. I kept it simple, told her I'd noticed someone on the property, asked if she'd sent anyone up to check on things. She said no. She said the house was locked, the power was off, and no one had been there since she'd come up in early January to collect a few personal items. She asked if I thought someone had broken in. I told her I didn't know, but I'd keep an eye on it.
The next morning, I walked up the road to Edmund's house. It was locked, as Nora had said. I walked the perimeter of the building. The ground was hard with frost, but in a few sheltered spots near the foundation, the earth was soft enough to hold an impression. I found boot prints, one set. They ran along the side of the house from the front yard to the back, the same path the figure had taken when it walked out of sight. The prints were consistent in size and depth. A man's boot, maybe size 10, the same size Edmund wore. They went around the back of the house and continued across the backyard toward the tree line. At the edge of the woods they stopped, not gradually, not trailing off into leaves and undergrowth. They just stopped. The last print was crisp and full, both heel and toe clearly defined, and beyond it there was nothing, as if the person who made them had simply stepped out of existence at the tree line. I bought a trail camera that afternoon, motion-activated, night vision, timestamp accurate to the second. I mounted it on a fence post at the edge of my property, aimed up the road toward Edmund's driveway. That evening, I watched from my porch until full dark, straining my eyes against the black. I didn't see him, but in the morning when I walked out to my truck, I found the boot prints. They were in the frost on my driveway, a single set,
coming from the direction of Edmund's house, walking in a straight line down the center of the gravel, each print pressed cleanly into the thin white layer of ice crystals that coated the stones. They came all the way down the driveway, past my truck, up to my front porch, and stopped at my front door. The last print was on the top step, maybe 6 inches from the threshold, angled slightly inward, as if the person who made it had been standing there, facing the door, facing the place where I'd been sleeping on the other side of a 2-inch slab of wood. I checked the trail camera. Motion-activated, infrared, clear field of view covering the entire road between my property and Edmund's. It had captured nothing, not a single frame, no figure on the road, no movement of any kind, no trigger event between sundown and sunrise. Whatever had walked down my driveway and stood at my front door had done so without tripping a motion sensor that could detect a rabbit at 50 yards. The boot prints continued every morning for the rest of February. Every single day, I'd wake up, open my front door, and there they'd be, a single set of tracks in the frost, coming from the direction of Edmund's place, walking straight and steady and unhesitating down my driveway to my front door. Some mornings the frost was light and the prints were faint. Some mornings, after a hard freeze, they were pressed deep and sharp, every tread mark visible, as if the person who made them had weight and substance and mass. They were always the same size, always the same boot, always stopping at the same spot. I never saw the figure at the mailbox again. Whatever I'd seen those 2 evenings in early February didn't repeat itself, at least not in a way my eyes could confirm. But every morning told me that something was still making the walk. Something was coming down that road in the dark, crossing the distance between Edmund's property and mine, and stopping at my door. Standing there. For how long, I don't know. Doing what, I can't say. On the last day of February, I did something I hadn't done in the weeks since this started. I opened my front door at night. It was around 2 in the morning. I'd been lying in bed, listening to the silence of Sutter Mill Road, and I felt something shift in it. Not a sound, a pressure. The feeling of someone standing on the other side of a door, that subtle displacement of air and attention you can sense even through solid wood if you're tuned to it. I got up, I walked to the front door, I put my hand on the knob and stood there for a long time, feeling the cold metal under my palm. And behind the cold, through the door, something else, a warmth, faint, localized, emanating from the other side of the door at about chest height, as if someone were standing there, close enough to touch, breathing warm air against the wood. I turned the knob and opened the door. The porch was empty. The road was dark. The mountain loomed against the sky, blacker than the black around it. The air was still and freezing. But on the top step, 6 inches from the threshold, there was a boot print in the frost, a single, fresh print, the ice crystals around it still settling, the edges still sharp. It had been made moments ago, seconds maybe. Whatever had been standing there had been there when I turned the knob, had been there when I felt the warmth through the door, and gone in the time it took me to pull the door open, gone without a sound, without a footstep, without disturbing the air. March came. The frost stopped, and with it the prints. I told myself it was over. Whatever February had brought, March had taken it away. But I know it's not over. I know it the way I know the mountain is there even when the clouds hide it. Because the thing about February is that it comes back. It always comes back. And Edmund's house is still up that road, dark and locked and holding whatever it holds. And the distance between his door and mine is still a 1/4 mile. A 1/4 mile is nothing to a man who has nowhere else to go and all night to walk it. I check the frost every morning now. Even in the months when there is no frost, I open my front door and I look down at the top step and I wait for the day when I see the print again. The single, fresh, impossibly present print of a dead man's boot 6 inches from where I sleep. And some nights, when the silence on Sutter Mill Road shifts in that particular way,
when it goes from empty to occupied, from quiet to watched. I stand at my front door with my hand on the knob, and I feel the warmth on the other side. And I wonder what would happen if I opened it faster, if I caught him there, if I looked into the face of whatever is wearing Edmund's shirt and standing in Edmund's boots and making Edmund's walk down a road that Edmund will never walk again. I wonder if it would wave.
Story 5. What pressed its hands against the ice? People who didn't live through the ice storm of February 2023 don't understand what it was like. They hear ice storm and they think of slick roads and canceled school and maybe a day without power. They don't understand the scale of it. They don't understand what it means when the entire infrastructure of a rural county, every power line, every road, every connection to the outside world goes down at once and stays down for days. We live in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. My wife, Renata, and I bought our place about 7 years ago, a 2-story farmhouse on 12 acres at the end of a road that branches off a county route. Our nearest neighbor is a half-mile away. In winter, when the leaves are down and the mountain behind our property stands bare and gray against the sky, you can see just how much nothing surrounds us. It's beautiful in the way that lonely things are beautiful. Renata and I chose it for that reason. We got what we wanted. What we didn't account for was what that space and silence become when the world around you shuts off and there's nothing left but the dark and the cold and whatever is in it. The storm started on a Thursday. The freezing rain began around noon and didn't stop. It fell with a steady, relentless patience, coating everything it touched in a layer of ice that thickened by the hour. By evening, the trees were glazed from root to crown, their branches bending under the weight, the whole forest making a sound like a chandelier being slowly crushed. The power went out at 8:47 p.m. We were as prepared as we could be. We had the wood stove, a decent supply of firewood, canned food, water, flashlights, batteries. We had our 2 dogs, Boone and Clementine, a German Shepherd and a Hound mix, both big enough to generate their own heat and loyal enough to stay close when things got bad. We settled in for the night and told ourselves it would be a day, maybe 2. It wasn't. Friday came and the rain continued. Saturday the same. The temperature dropped. The ice on the trees reached a thickness I'd never seen before. 1/2 inch, maybe more, encasing every branch, every twig in a shell of clear, hard ice that caught the gray daylight and threw it back in dull flashes. Trees started falling. Not 1 or 2, dozens. The sound was constant, a percussion of cracks and crashes rolling through the forest from every direction, near and far, all day and all night. By the 3rd day, Sunday, we were running low on firewood. Renata suggested the furniture. We had an old bookcase in the spare room made of cheap pine and a set of wooden chairs we've been meaning to replace. I broke them apart with a hatchet and fed them to the stove piece by piece. It felt wrong, burning our own belongings, but the house was dropping below 50 degrees in the rooms away from the stove, and the dogs were pressed against us with a desperation that went beyond affection. They were cold. We were all cold. Sunday night is when the tapping started. Renata and I were sitting on the couch in the living room, which we'd turned into our survival camp. The stove was there, the blankets were there, the dogs were there. The candles threw a soft, unsteady light. The ice was still falling outside, ticking against the roof and the windows with a sound like tiny fingers drumming. But underneath that constant ambient patter, there was something else. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a pause. I heard it first on the front window, the big double pane in the living room. It was louder than the ice, more deliberate, more rhythmic, not the random scatter of freezing rain hitting glass. A pattern, a sequence, 3 evenly spaced taps, each one firm and distinct, followed by a pause of about 2 seconds, then 3 more. It sounded like knuckles on glass, like someone standing outside the window, raising their hand and knocking. I looked at Renata. She'd heard it too. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the window.
The curtains were drawn. We'd closed them all to keep in whatever heat we could, so there was nothing to see except the fabric, and beyond it, the faint glow of ice catching the candlelight. "Wind," I said. "Ice on a branch." But the nearest tree to that window was 30 feet away. I'd cut back the old maple 2 summers ago, specifically to keep branches away from the house. There was nothing close enough to reach the glass, nothing that could tap with that kind of regularity and force. The tapping stopped at the front window. For maybe 10 seconds, the house was quiet, except for the stove and the ambient rain. Then it started again, this time at the kitchen window on the opposite side of the house. Same pattern, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, as if whatever was doing it had moved from one side of the house to the other in the time it takes to draw a breath. Renata stood up. "I'm going to look." "Don't," I said. I said it quickly, without thinking, with a certainty that came from somewhere below my rational mind, not from logic, from instinct. Renata sat back down. She didn't argue. I think she felt it too. The tapping continued. It moved to the bedroom window, then to the bathroom, then the small window in the spare room. It was circling the house clockwise, moving around the perimeter in a steady, deliberate orbit, pausing at each window long enough to deliver its sequence before moving to the next. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. The circuit took about 2 minutes. When it completed, it started again, and again, and again. The dogs knew. Boone and Clementine had moved to the center of the room, as far from the walls as they could get. They were pressed together, Clementine's head tucked under Boone's chin, both of them trembling with a fine, continuous vibration that I could feel through the cushions. Their eyes were open and moving, tracking something, following a path around the room that matched the progression of the tapping, window by window. They were silent. They shook and they watched, and they didn't make a sound. That went on for hours. The tapping circled and circled, patient and mechanical, until the pattern became a kind of terrible metronome I could feel in my teeth. Renata and I sat on the couch with the dogs between us, wrapped in blankets, not talking, barely moving. At some point, I don't know when, the hours blurred together. I realized that the freezing rain had stopped. The ice had stopped ticking on the roof. The only sound from outside was the tapping. 3 and 3 and 3, moving in its circle, and nothing else. The world beyond our walls had gone absolutely silent, as if everything out there, the wind, the rain, the forest, the night itself, had pulled back to make room for whatever was walking around our house. Eventually, I slept. I don't know how. Exhaustion, maybe? The body's refusal to sustain that level of adrenaline indefinitely. I woke up on the couch with Renata asleep beside my shoulder and the dogs still between us, still trembling, and gray light coming through the curtains. Monday morning, the tapping had stopped. Monday was quiet. I went outside for firewood and checked the perimeter of the house. The ice was thick on everything, the porch, the steps, the railing, the ground. I looked at the windows, expecting to find marks or scratches. The ice on the glass was smooth and unbroken. Whatever had been tapping hadn't left a trace. Monday night was the 4th night. The tapping didn't come back. I waited for it, my ears tuned to the frequency of 3 and 3, but the windows stayed quiet. Then I heard the breathing. It came from the back door, the door that opened onto the porch behind the kitchen, the one I'd been using to access the woodpile. It was a solid door, wood with a glass upper panel, and at the bottom there was a gap, maybe an half-inch of space between the door and the threshold where the weather stripping had worn away. I'd been meaning to replace it for 2 years. The breathing came through that gap, deep, slow, wet. Each inhale was a long, shuddering draw, the sound of air being pulled through something moist and thick. Each exhale was a low, heavy push, warm enough that I could feel it, or imagined I could, as a faint change in the air temperature near the floor. Whatever was breathing was pressed against the door, close, intimate. Its mouth, if it had one, and the sound certainly suggested something that did, was right against the gap, directing its breath into the house with a precision that felt intentional. Renata was awake. She was gripping my arm hard enough to leave marks I'd find the next morning. The dogs were rigid, their eyes locked on the back door, their bodies so tense I could feel the vibration of their muscles through the cushions. Their lips were pulled back from their teeth, but they weren't growling. Whatever hierarchy of threat existed in their animal mind, whatever was behind that door occupied a level above anything they were willing to challenge. The breathing continued for maybe 20 minutes, slow, patient, unbroken. It didn't speed up or slow down. It didn't change in volume or intensity. It was the breathing of something that arrived at a destination and was content to be there.
I got my shotgun, a 12-gauge pump I kept in the hall closet loaded with buckshot. I picked it up and walked to the back door and racked a shell into the chamber, the hard metallic clack that every living thing on Earth recognizes as a threat. The breathing didn't change. I unlocked the deadbolt. I turned the knob. I pulled the door open. The porch was empty. The backyard was empty. The tree line 50 yards away was a wall of ice-coated trunks standing motionless in the dark. The air was still and cold, so cold it burned my throat on the first breath. There was nothing behind the door, nothing standing on the porch, nothing retreating across the yard. Just the ice and the dark and a silence so complete it felt like pressure. I looked down. The porch was covered in handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the thin layer of ice that coated the wood. Each one a clear, detailed impression, palm, fingers, the texture of skin frozen into the frozen surface. They were everywhere, on the floor of the porch, on the railing, on the posts, on the siding next to the door. Some overlapped, some were isolated. They covered every surface within reach of something standing on the porch, as if whatever had been there had pressed its hands against everything it could touch. They were too large. Each print was at least a foot across from the base of the palm to the tip of the longest finger. The fingers themselves were wrong. Too long, too thin, with an extra joint or a curve that didn't match any hand I'd ever seen. They looked like the hands of something that was almost human, but had been stretched, elongated, reshaped by a process that had no interest in proportion. I stood on that porch for a long time, looking at the prints, feeling the cold crawl into me through my boots and my clothes and my skin. Then I went back inside and locked the door and sat down on the couch next to my wife and didn't say a word. The power came back on Tuesday afternoon. The ice began to melt on Wednesday. By Thursday, the handprints on the porch were gone, dissolved back into water, running off the wood in thin rivulets that carried no memory of what had made them. The roads cleared. The world reassembled itself around us, filling in the gaps that the storm had torn open. And within a week, everything looked the way it had before. Normal, functioning, explained. Renata and I didn't talk about it. Not immediately. The days after the storm were consumed by practical concerns. We moved through the recovery the way people move through the aftermath of any crisis, focused, efficient, unwilling to look back until the forward motion stops. It was almost 2 weeks later when Renata told me. We were in bed, lights off, the house warm and humming with electricity, the dogs asleep at our feet. She said it quietly, the way you say things you've been holding in your chest and can't carry anymore. She said that on the third night, Sunday, the night the tapping circled the house, she had looked. When I told her not to, when I'd said it with that instinctive certainty, she'd nodded and sat back down. But later, when I'd fallen asleep on the couch, she'd gotten up. She'd gone to the kitchen window and pulled back the curtain an inch and looked out. She said she saw a face pressed against the glass from the outside, close, inches away, pressed flat against the window the way a child presses their face to a store window, forehead and nose and cheeks distorted by the pressure. The face was smiling, a wide-open smile that showed too many teeth, that stretched the lips beyond where lips should stretch, that turned the expression from something joyful into something anatomically wrong. The face was pressed so hard against the glass that the ice on the outside had cracked around the point of contact, spiderwebbing out from the nose and forehead in thin fracture lines. And the face, she said, looked like me. Not exactly like me, not a mirror image, but close enough that the resemblance was unmistakable, and close enough that the differences were worse than if it had looked nothing like me at all. My features, my bone structure, my proportions, but stretched slightly, adjusted slightly, as if something had studied my face and rebuilt it from memory without quite understanding how the pieces fit together.
The eyes were mine, but set too wide. The jaw was mine, but too long. The smile was something I'd never made and never would. She said it looked at her through the glass for 3 or 4 seconds, that it pulled back from the window and was gone. She heard the tapping resume at the next window, continuing its circuit, and she went back to the couch and sat down next to me and didn't say anything. Until 2 weeks later, in our bed, in the dark, and the house was quiet and warm, and the dog slept, and the world outside was normal. And I thought about a face that looked like mine pressed against our window in an ice storm, smiling a smile I'd never smiled, circling our house with a patience that suggested it had done this before and would do it again. February is coming back. The long-range forecasts are already talking about a cold stretch at the end of the month. Possible ice. Renata hasn't mentioned it. I haven't mentioned it, but I've noticed things. I've noticed that she started pulling the curtains earlier in the evening. I've noticed she's bought heavier curtains for the kitchen, the kind you can't see through even when you hold a light behind them. I've noticed she's not gone near the back door after dark anymore. And I've noticed one more thing. The wood stove doesn't hold heat the way it used to. Or maybe the house doesn't hold heat the way it used to. Because on cold nights, even with the stove burning strong and the house sealed tight, there's a draft, a faint, persistent cold that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the walls themselves are breathing in the winter air through gaps too small to see. And sometimes when I put my hand against the back door, against the gap at the bottom where the weather stripping is still worn, I feel something coming through from the other side. Not wind, not cold. Warmth. A faint, rhythmic warmth that pulses against my fingers like breath. I still haven't replaced that weather stripping. I don't know why. Maybe because replacing it would mean admitting that something was breathing through it, or maybe because part of me is afraid that sealing the gap won't stop it breathing. It'll just make it find another way in. Or maybe because in the quietest, darkest part of my mind, in the place where the thoughts live that I'll never say out loud, I want to know what's on the other side. I want to understand what wears my face and circles my house and presses its 2 large hands into the ice on my porch. I want to know what it's smiling about. I just don't want to open the door to find out.